Hello and welcome to the Mastermind, Body, and Spirit Show. I'm your host, Matt Belair. Today's guest is co-founder and managing partner at Navalent, working with CEOs and executives pursuing transformational change for their organizations, leaders, and industries. He is a best-selling author of 8 books and popular contributor at Harvard Business Review and Forbes. He has a 30-year track record helping some of the world's most influential executives tackle challenges of strategy, organization, and leadership. From startups to Fortune 10s, turnarounds to new markets and strategies, overhauling leadership and culture to redesigning for growth, he has worked in more than 25 countries on 4 continents. He has been featured in Fortune, CEO Magazine, Business Insider, MSNBC, and more. Welcome to the show, Ron Carucci.
Hey, Matt, how are you? Good to be with you.
Yeah, good to have you on the show. I was blessed to have somebody introduce us, and I looked at your work, and I was like, holy smokes, got a 2-time TED speaker. You've been working and just kicking butt in big-time business and that kind of thing. And I was like, great, he's going to come on my podcast and share his wisdom. So thanks for coming.
It's good to be here.
So, well, why don't we give the audience a little background on who you are, like your work and what you've been up to, and we'll dive wherever you think you would like to go. We can go into leadership. You said you just did when we first started a research on honesty. I assume that's within organizations and for the self. I think that's really an interesting topic. So I'll let you give the audience a little background on who you are, and then we'll dive in where you'd like to start.
Yeah, well, so I spend my days with my friends at Navalent, traipsing the world and the hallways of all kinds of organizations, alongside all kinds of leaders who are stuck in a ditch, or there's some hill they want to take that they can't get to, or there's some aspiration they have that they can't quite figure out how to reach. And we help them accompany them and craft that journey to get from where they're stuck or to where they want. We do that through a variety of ways, helping them fix their organizations or fix themselves sometimes when they are the biggest challenge. And it's a privilege. We get to wake up every day and think about how to leave the world better than we found it. And it's a real treat.
Well, it sounds like some interesting work. I think you kind of glossed on a lot of stuff because you've written 8 books. A few of them are on leadership. So do you want to touch on any of those books, or do you want to go right into your current study on honesty and organizational honesty?
Well, we can. So let's, there's a little bit of the last book, Rise into Power, was a little bit of a predecessor to the honesty study. So we have a phenomenal database of great interviews we do with our executives. We've been doing them for 15 years. So at the 10-year mark, we had about 2,700 interviews in our database. And at that point, what we had learned about executives was that we've known, a statistic that had been known for a long time, which was more than half of them fail in their first 18 months. They get appointed to a bigger job or a bigger role of more influence, and they flame out within a year or a year and a half. And that had just become a normal, everyday routine statistic. And, careers and families and opportunities were, piling up in the carnage behind this statistic. And we thought we can do better. Well, it got real personal for us when people in our own organizations that we were consulting with were being given roles as a result of our transformational work and not succeeding in those. And so we thought we wanted to find out why, because it doesn't make sense that we can't figure out how it is people who are in suddenly being told they're high potential, they have great futures, they're the next coming for leadership, and suddenly within a year they're a disaster. So we examined at the 10-year mark the 2,700 interviews and organizations we had worked with to see if we could see any patterns. What was causing these leaders to fail? And we did. We uncovered some remarkably consistent patterns, not just among the failure group about what was causing leaders to tank, but what were the other ones who were sticking the landing doing? What were the ones that were actually thriving at higher altitudes and making a difference for the communities and organizations they led? What was setting them apart? So that was exciting for us. In the last couple of years, we've spent a lot of time helping the world and helping leaders and changing some careers and changing organizations by helping them make different choices in their leadership. Well, so fast forward 4 years, now we have 15 years of data. We went back to that same pile of data, now 3,300 interviews strong, to say, okay, so if we know what it takes to have leaders thrive in those organizations, and we see the kinds of organizations that produce great leaders, what else could we learn about those systems? What else could we figure out about what it takes to be a healthy, thriving community of people united in some common purpose or cause? And we didn't have any parameters. We have phenomenal artificial intelligence software and great analytical tools to help read data and take out human bias and really understand what the truth is about the information, so we're not imposing a hypothesis. And we did not expect to find information on honesty, what it is that causes people to lie in organizations. Well, I think, I'm sure it's true in your country where you are, Matt, but certainly here in the US, you don't have to look very far or ahead or behind many days to find some example in some place where somebody has misled somebody and somebody's withheld the truth or distorted the information or created fake news or manipulated some data set to get other people to think a certain thing. And it's frustrating. I think people are at their wits' end trying to figure out, who can I trust? What information is reliable? Why are you telling me that? And what is it you want from me? And the suspicion and paranoia we have about who's telling us things. And so we wanted to know, in the context of a community or an organization, how do you change that? How do you make sure, under what conditions could organizations be doing things that actually encourage people to be lying? And we found four. We found four remarkably obvious patterns that when people hear them, they're like, oh my gosh, that's the organization I work for. And I think what companies are doing is they don't realize that they're unwittingly, in allowing these conditions to flourish, that they're actually encouraging folks to distort the truth. So that's my lead-in.
Interesting. Well, I'm very curious on what those four things you discovered are. And I'm also curious if you've noticed any principles in leadership. I think that leadership in so many organizations and even in life is important, wherever you are, like to be a leader of your family, to be a leader in your community, to be a leader in your organization. So I'm curious about the individual's process. What makes a leader? Like, what kind of environments or external things can cause positive growth for leadership? Let's say we're working with youth or we're bringing somebody up in our organization. And also, what are some attributes to great leaders? Like, what is it? It's kind of like the same question, but it's like, what will foster and develop leadership? And what are those characteristics fully formed when you are that leader?
So the first one, I'll go back to our first study and I'll draw from that because I think there's some insights that apply to all of us. The first one is context. Meaning, as a leader, are you studying in a curious way your environment? Are you showing up to your role with answers or questions? When leaders feel like they have some mandate to come and be the answer ATM, to show up with the direction, the choice, without studying what's happening around them, they forfeit curiosity. But a leader's best posture in an opening move is to be curious about, why is it the way it is, even if it's broken, or even if it's not the way you want it, or even if it's odd to you. Don't start with the presumption of, all I know is all there is to know. Start with the presumption of there's more to know, and I should go find it out. But if you start with the sense of, I'm here to change this, and you have a little bit of a hero syndrome about that, you're dangerously set up to fail. Because you have to accept that the context you're leading in has as much to change in you as you have to change in it. And if you don't approach it with that posture, you're likely to get organ rejected out of the context. The second is breadth. So, in a family, in a Boy Scout troop, in a Little League team, in our schools, in our big corporations, groups of people naturally fragment. Right? They naturally come apart. They naturally gravitate toward their own mini tribes or to their own people who are like them or their own department or their own group. So leaders start typically presiding over some type of fragmented situation. Their job is to make sure, A, they don't intensify that fragmentation, but to bring cohesion to it. How do they find the seams of the people in their family or the people in their communities or the groups and teams that make up their organization and bring them together? And most leaders, especially if they've grown up in a particular functional bias, so if they grew up in finance, they see the world economically. If they grew up in marketing, they see the world through consumers. If they're the father, they see the world through, cleaning the house and getting the chores done and saving money. If they're the mother, they see the world through getting homework done and being kind to each other. And so they have a view based on their role. But when you're leading, your job is to see all the views and stitch the seams together and bring cohesion and find out how to bring people together by building bridges. The third is choice. So, if you're leading, you're making decisions. And sometimes those decisions are hard. I tell people that leadership is the ability to disappoint people at a rate they can absorb. You're going to let people down. And if you have a predisposed need to please people, to say yes to requests just to purchase popularity or to purchase loyalty, or to make sure you don't make people frustrated because you don't want to feel estranged from them, you're going to fail as a leader and you're going to institutionalize mediocrity. You have to be willing to narrow the focus of people on a few priorities, on a few things. And sometimes it means saying no to even great ideas so that the ideas you've already committed to can prevail. And that's hard for leaders, especially hard for entrepreneurs. They want to say yes to everything. And the last one was connection. It's the relationships you form. Whether it's with bosses, peers, direct reports, customers, siblings, the basis on which you establish trust, the basis on which you establish your credibility is a critical part of leadership. And many people prioritize their network or their stakeholders according to who they need something from and what they need from them. But the leaders in our study who were the most successful, who set themselves apart in the success group, were the ones who prioritized their stakeholder group according to who they could contribute to, who they could make a difference for, whose success could they advance, whose development could they strengthen. So if you're a leader, yes, there are people you have to rely on, and you certainly should rely on them and get what you need from them to accomplish the community's goals. But how you spend your time, by and large, in relationship to other people, you should be thinking as much, if not more, about who can you contribute to, who can you make more successful, not what can you get from them. And every community has them, right? You've seen them, Matt. It's the boss everybody wants to work for. It's the leader who every little league team coach wants to be part of. We all know, we see them, we know who they are. So context, breadth, choice, connection. The hardest part about our study was that the successful leaders did all four well. So no matter how many, we did 99 different regression analyses to see if I could refute that, because I didn't want to have to say that. Every time, if you did 3 of the 4 well, you were in the failure group. The only way to succeed was to see all those 4 things as one thing with 4 parts. So the great news is they're learnable. You can learn them early in your career. You can learn them in a family early. You can teach your kids this early, to think about how to be curious in new situations, how to build bridges among people, how to make hard, important choices and stick to them, and how to build connections that you contribute to. If you wait till your most senior level role of influence in your life to start learning some of the ones you're not good at, that's probably going to not go too well.
Interesting. Well, it's funny because when I'm listening to it, I feel like it's common sense, but we sometimes don't operate that way, especially in business. It's more about the bottom line of you're talking about connection. And I remember reading The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari by Robin Sharma years ago. And it just talked about the number one motivator of employees was not money. It was actually appreciation. And then you can read. Go ahead.
More about the bottom line of
the Facebook Live get you?
Reading The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari by Robin Sharma years ago.
Something happened here.
About the number one
you just got to close the Facebook. The Facebook Live will get you if your Facebook is open. It's got me before, but
it got me.
Yeah, I've done it before. I'm like, whoop, but I'm doing it. Yeah. So Robin Sharma and The Monk Who Sold the Ferrari just talked about appreciation being the number one motivator, but also you look at how to influence friends, how to win friends and influence people. Again, how to create community or how to create a connection. And it just comes to being a good human being, being a good role model, appreciating someone else, creating connection. And what can you give them as far as value? How can you help them? And they're very basic principles, but I think that in business and sometimes in the world, we don't think that way. We're kind of thinking a little bit selfishly, a little bit on the bottom line. And if you do that, you can kind of get yourself into a pickle eventually. So what I'm curious about, and it's a little bit of kind of like a digress, but I don't know, you've worked with really big corporations, really big companies, a lot of dough on the line, millions of dollars. And so they need to make a decision. So what I'm curious about is, how do you go in and operate and know if a company is functioning well and they're cohesive and they're on the move, or what are some things that you find and you look for trouble? You're like, oh, they're going to be in trouble if these things are happening. And the final question is pretty vague, but I'll let you speak on it. It's like when you go in there and you're in these big companies, what do you look for if they're going to make a decision on something? Is there a process that you go through to make a good decision? Because I think a lot of young entrepreneurs, they're making these decisions and they're trying to make the right decision. And I feel like when you're in there consulting, you might have a decision between A and B. And I'm just curious if you have protocols for any of that.
So there's a lot in there. Let me unpack a little bit of it. So your first question is, how do we enter organizations? So we have a really rigorous diagnostic process when we go into a company. You know, if you went into your cardiologist and said, I got this really sharp pain right here in my chest, the cardiologist squinted and said, oh yeah, that's your upper left ventricle. It needs a stent. Let's go put one in. You might be a little concerned that they didn't want to look first. And so for us, it's no different. You're asking us to tinker with your organization and find out what's going on. We do an MRI. So we go in and do a pretty forensic, deep look under the hood about what's going on in your organization so we can get the lay of the land and really understand it holistically. You're going to have your opinions about what's wrong and why. I already know those are flawed, because if those assumptions had been right, you'd have fixed the problem already and you wouldn't have called me. So I already know that at best you have part of the answer, and in many cases, completely the wrong answer. So once we have a holistic diagnosis of here's what's really going on in this system, however the system is defined and however large it is, then I can make some different choices around, okay, well, here's the problem you say you want to fix, or here's what you say you want to become. Here's what has to happen then in order to change that. And so along that journey of transformation are endless series of choices and options. The reality is it's very rare in organizational life where you have complex problems for which there is a right answer. So to your question about A and B, the minute I know you've reduced a decision down to a binary, I already know you have the worst options available, because there's no choice in life for which is typically only two answers. So now that you've reduced it to two, now what I know is we're pitting wills. So now I know that one person thinks A is right, one person thinks B is right. So A's primary goal is to prove B wrong, and vice versa, right? So I need to help you zoom out and go, okay, let's create a bigger menu of options here, because there's an optimal option somewhere here, and the best option is the one you're going to commit to making work. But if you're looking for the right option, or if you're suddenly looking to make your option the best option, that's a very different process than the right option or the best option. So when it comes to decision making, I want to know what data is informing your choices. What level of intuition or experience are you relying on? Whose voices have you included in the process? And whose voices have you excluded from the process? Often I'll learn a ton about a leader when they tell me what data they didn't consider and whose opinion they didn't ask for. And I want to, and it's not, not everything's consensus, not everything's democracy. We don't have the luxury of time in life to ask everybody's opinion how they feel about something, and that's actually bad leadership. But if I see a pattern of certain types of views or perspectives or data sets not entering the conversation, then I'm going to be curious about that. I think used to be that information was power, right? That whoever had the information had the power. These days, that's silly because it's ubiquitous. Now it's whose interpretation of the information is prevailing. And so I want to know who's influencing you, whose voice is mattering to you. When you have dueling fact bases, and that's common these days, right? I can make the facts anything they want. How are you letting the fact bases duel? How are the debates unfolding? What biases are corrupting or hijacking the conversation in a way that may be either playing you or fooling you or colluding with you? And so I'm going to see those patterns pretty quickly as you're making choices about your organization. And then when it comes to the broader issue of decision making, which is governance, right? So how are decision making institutionalized at your company? I'm going to examine where it's happening and by who, because almost always the problem of governance is it's held too close to the top, and it's not distributed where it needs to be, or it's so decentralized that nobody knows who makes what decisions. I joke about a game show I see companies playing all the time. Whose decision is it? Whose decision is it anyway? Because most people don't know who's making the decision today, which they eventually learn to use to their advantage, right? Because if I don't know who's making the decision, I'll decide what the decision was and go about acting as if I got my way. And that's when you see all kinds of fragmentation happen in companies. Everybody's off doing their own thing, interpreting whatever came down from on high as, nope, that's what I wanted. Or you have leaders who are very waffly. I have a client who used to be called the waffle, because the classic game of last one in, whoever was in the meeting last, or whoever in the last conversation got their way. And so people would actually time their conversations like to get into him like just minutes before the executive team meeting, so that in the meeting your decision got announced. And they had learned to actually manipulate the leader that way. It was a well-grooved process. People would watch the door. And so, as leaders, whether you realize it or not, you're training your organization how to work with you. You may be training them about things about yourself you may not intend to.
Interesting. Well, there's a lot of good insight there. And I think that just even understanding those, they're all just very grounded and they make a lot of sense. So I like how just practical it is. And what I'm thinking about is, do you have any core elements or principles when you look at a company like Amazon or companies that have just exploded and they're successful companies? Is there common principles that they have that somebody if they're a young entrepreneur, they're starting a business, that they can apply to their lives?
Well, I don't know if I'd ever hold up any singular company as an example. They all have their flaws, right? Amazon does a lot of things great, and they have a lot of things about their culture that are very flawed. I think the biggest issue I see in young entrepreneur startups, and I've got a number of clients in Silicon Valley and other sectors in biotech and technology that are startups. And the biggest things I see problematically with entrepreneurs is their impulsivity and their inability to understand their role as a leader. And so, startups by nature are frantic. They're chaotic. That's a part of the deal. But at some point, you have to start imposing order on that chaos. You can't just get to 100 people and think it's okay. And so many entrepreneurs are afraid to bring order to that chaos early because that's not what they like. And so they're afraid to say no. When you say the word strategy to them, they get very anxious. But the reality is, so I'll often ask, well, tell me what your strategy is. And they show me the business plan that they use to get their Series A funding or their angel investing. Or they'll show me some cheesy mission statement that somebody wrote up, or some vision statement that somebody wrote up, or their values. Or they'll show me the orders, right? Costco called, here's the order, that's the strategy. Or they'll show me some product sales goals. And what an entrepreneur needs to understand is that none of that is strategy. Tell me who you are. Tell me who you are to competitors. Tell me who you are to your customers. What people should be choosing you, and why would they choose you over somebody else doing the exact same thing as you? What sets you apart? Where have you invested your money to become great at what sets you apart? Those are the questions of identity that entrepreneurs have to answer very early, and they're afraid to, or they don't know to. The hard part about that is that you begin to recognize that not all work is created equal, right? So when you invite your first 10 friends into the, all for one for all, you create this very dangerous false sense of egalitarianism, right? We're all equal. Well, the truth is we're not. We're all equal as human beings, all deserve the same love and respect. But when it comes to the work, and now you get to 30 people and 40 people and 80 people, the work is not the same. And there's work that you do that's competitive work, that truly delivers that differentiation, that sets you apart among competitors, of why customers would keep coming to you. That's the work that if you spend $1 on that work, $5 comes in the door. There's work that's enabling work. So it's the work that directly supports that competitive work. And together, those things make up about 35 or maybe 40% of the work in your organization. There's 60% of your work, or maybe even 70% of your work, that's just necessary. It keeps the lights on. It keeps you out of jail. It keeps you in compliance. You don't need to be better at it than anybody else. You just need to be efficient at it and do it for as cheaply as possible without compromising quality. And those are not the same. But the problem is when it all gets mixed together, the gravitational pull and the immediacy of the necessary work always dilutes the competitive work. And the competitive work and the work that supports it, you have to protect that work. Well, entrepreneurs don't want to separate that work. They don't want to disproportionately invest their money into the competitive work. They don't want to make it look like those people are more important. They don't want anybody to feel bad. And all of that is bad leadership, and it's a false sense of understanding how you separate your work if you want to grow and scale to a bigger place. So the decision-making I see entrepreneurs need to do is make those early decisions about identity and strategy, separate out the work and invest disproportionately in the work that's going to make you special and keep you distinct. And then lead the organization to be cohesive. Just because someone's doing necessary work like accounting or HR or IT doesn't make them a less important human being than the person doing your innovation or your customer service or whatever it is that makes the magic. But if you're treating them as if the work is equal, you're actually serving to confuse the organization. You're not making people feel good at all.
Interesting. I could definitely see how that's a very common trait with startups, especially if you're working with friends and things like that. Once it grows, is a very common thing that they talk about scaling companies and things like that. You just don't know what to do. And it's hard to make those hard choices because, like you say, you don't want to hurt people's feelings. So what I want to get into to make sure we cover it, because there's some other questions that I want to ask you around entrepreneurship, is your study on honesty. Yeah. And those, I don't know if you said there were pillars or there are 4 common traits, or if you just want to go into that study, like what was the intention of the study and what did you discover?
Well, so, it was building on our 10-year study. Now at 15 years, I wanted to know, we had studied for individual leadership behavior in the first round. I wanted to know more about organizations. I want to know about the system, the community of people coming together to, in a shared human endeavor to do something they cared about. I wanted to understand what could go wrong in that system. And as I said before, I wasn't initially looking for anything on honesty, but that's what we found. We found that organizations are creating conditions under which people are forced to lie. So let's, building on some of what we just talked about, let's talk about the issue of identity and strategy, right? If you walk into any organization, the entrepreneurs don't want to have one. The big companies all think they do have one, or the mid caps. But if you go around and ask what it is, you get 10 different answers, right? You get the mission statement, you get a vision statement. And if you ask people, okay, so that's your mission statement. How often during the day do you feel like that mission statement is shaping your choices or your behavior? I don't even know what the mission statement is. Or, well, how about the values? Do you feel like you live the values? Oh, those are just for the website. Well, when you lack strategic clarity, meaning when who you say you are is not what you actually do, you create duplicity. You create a sense of, I'm not who I say I am. Well, we all know that, we've heard the engagement stats on 70% of the workforce being checked out and 50% feel like they have no purpose. And to your point before about the greatest thing you can give people is a sense of meaning, you're not doing it now. When that's the condition, from a strategic identity point of view, you're 3 times more likely to have people lie or withhold the truth. Because once you've said that duplicity is okay, you give me permission to follow suit. And when we don't know who we are, we're going to make it up. Because we're meaning-seeking machines. I need to feel like my work matters. So if I don't see how that's the case, I'm going to make it up. Meaning, when you ask me to forecast the sales, I'm going to bump it up a little bit. When you ask me to tell you what went wrong in the last objective, I'm going to blame somebody else. When you ask me about what I think is possible in a future or how I want to contribute, I'm going to be opportunistic. Because that's what you've told me is expected of me. The second condition was accountability. So when people in your organization or in your family perceive that the way their contributions are assessed is not fair, you're 3.5 times more likely to have people lie or withhold the truth. Because if I feel like it's not a safe place to own my mistakes, or if I feel like my work is not being valued, I'm going to embellish it. And it's not about how it's compensated. To your point before, people are not motivated by money. It's I want to know that I matter. And if I don't know that you see that, I'm going to lie. The third was governance. So building on our talked before about decision making. If in my organization I perceive that decision making is not transparent, if I can't detect on what criteria you're making choices and I don't trust them, or I feel like I have to rely on rumors and innuendo to get information I need to make my decisions, you're now 3 times more likely to have people lie or withhold the truth. Because if it has to go underground, I'm going to make up what I want. And the last one, building on our talk about cohesion before, this was a bit of a surprise, was the issue of conflict and border wars. When you have unresolved conflict between sales and marketing, between mom and dad, between the Little League coach and the parents, when there are seams of a community for which there's a border war, you are 6 times more likely to have people lie or withhold the truth. Because when you fragment people, you fragment the truth. You create dueling truths. And now I have to prove my truth to be right. I think there's an expression that has emerged in the last couple of years in a very polarized environment, politically and otherwise, and economically, where people say the word, speak your truth. And I hate the expression because we've dangerously confused people to make them think that speaking your truth is the same thing as speaking the truth. That if I'm speaking it, it's true. And people speak it as if that's the case. And that's super dangerous. And so the painful part about all those statistics, Matt, is that they're cumulative. So if you don't know who you are and you're making it up, if your accountability is seen as unfair, if decision-making is not transparent and people don't know how to expect to get choices made and they don't participate in the ones that affect them, and if there's unresolved conflict between important pieces of your community, all up, all in, you're 16 times more likely, 16 times more likely to find yourself on the cover of a newspaper in a headline about a story you never wanted to be in. Wells Fargo, said about themselves, we go the extra mile to do the right thing. A year before their indictment, they were the number 7 most admired company on Barron's list, number 18 or 20 on the Fortune list, right? 5,000 people didn't wake up one day at Wells Fargo all at the same time and say, hey, here's an idea on how to do better cross-selling. That's not what happened. So, how you account, and if you look at the Justice Department's findings of their investigation of the Wells Fargo, horrible situation, the number 1 finding was a gap between a stated and actual mission. The sad thing is when you create conditions under which people lose their sense of self-honesty, they lose themselves, right? They lose their sense of who they are in the world. They lose their sense of purpose. And they start thinking that I have to hide who I am to participate in the world. And if you expose somebody to those conditions for long periods of time, we see it every day, right? I mean, I saw blog, articles and episodes on your podcast thinking about this, about, why is it men in their 50s are depressed? Why is it people in their 40s are suddenly finding their own sense of addictions raising because they feel meaningless? Because they've been subjected to conditions for so long where they just became numb and they lost their soul to a condition that said, don't be yourself. You feel like an imposter because you are an imposter. So act like one. And suddenly people wake up and realize, wait, I don't know who I am anymore. Or some life crisis or some health crisis or some unforeseen catastrophe hits their world and they're unable to withstand it because they've lost their grounding. They've lost their sense of integrity. They've become so flexible in their values to accommodate the situation they're in to survive it, that now when they need to reach for those values and those principles most, they're not there.
Yeah. Wow. Well, you definitely touched on a lot of interesting things there. I love your study. It's a very powerful study. And what it brings up for me is like the individual in the organization and what you touched on at the end, talking about losing yourself and finding meaningless. I think a lot of people in, let's say, 9 to 5 or the corporate world will talk about getting grinded down, and that's where, whether it's one boss that isn't ideal or whatever the case is, it's just over time. And then I think a lot of, for me, about the podcast is like, how do we find meaning? How do we find purpose? How do we find our own power, our own leadership? And so that could be within an organization. It could be going out on your own. So within your study and your expertise, what would you recommend to an individual, either in an organization or just in life in general, whatever you think would be most useful? Because a lot of the people in an organization that are unhappy have the power and ability to start their own thing that might be more aligned with their values, because they're in a company. Like, I have a really good friend, and he worked in a slaughterhouse. Now, it wasn't against his values. It was just a really traumatizing job, and he did it for his family. So he made money, and he wouldn't even tell me the stories. He's like, bro, you don't want to know the crap that I've seen. And I was like, well, this can't be good. This can't be good for your consciousness and your life. And so that's a challenging situation. So I'm wondering if you've come across things that can really just empower an individual, whether they are at the top of the company or they're in the company and they're looking to come back into their own values and skill sets and leadership and power and all that. Because I know your TED Talk was on power, and I only got through half of it, but it was really good. How to be more powerful than powerless. And I invite everybody to check that out.
So, Matt, I think the first step is what you described. Do an emotional and a spiritual health check, right? Do you even know what your values are? Do you know what you stand for? If you're not certain how to ask that question, do some of the classic, write the eulogy you wish your best friend would give at your funeral. What do you want the obituary to say about your life? When someone asks your kid at school, tell me about your mom or your dad, what do you want them to say? And then step back and read those things and ask yourself, am I on track for those to be true? Am I living the one I ask leaders is, would you be willing to let a video camera follow you around all day long and then use that video to train other people? And if the answer is heck no, then why? There's something about the way you're living your life that's not embodying who you say you are. So find out how big the gap is. I don't believe that everybody who's quit and stayed in a company, and who's just marking time playing Candy Crush or looking at LinkedIn all day, that the answer is go start your own company. Not everybody's meant to be an entrepreneur, and that's not an answer for everybody. And everybody thinks, I don't want to work for the man. I'm going to go do my own thing, and then they fail because that's not how they're wired. But you don't have to stay. If you've quit and stayed, be honest about that, because you're on a conveyor belt now that's going to have you wake up in 10 years very depressed and like, where did I lose my life to? And then you're going to be very resentful, and that's typically an ugly moment. So get out. If you got a mortgage and kids and all the things that you think are the golden handcuffs, that's a lie. Definitely unhinge yourself from the lies that have told you have no other choice, and disconnect from that, because that's not true. It may not be start your own company, but there are other organizations that match who you want to be and who you say you are. Don't wait till you're so fed up that you think, I got to be out of here within 3 weeks. Sometimes a major career transition like that may take a year for you to do the research and the homework and the field trips to go experiment and observe and go find the right place for you. Give yourself that year. For goodness sake, don't waste 5 more years dreaming and fantasizing about something that you could actually be making happen now. And remember, you're going to hire a boss, right? So you're interviewing somebody to be your next boss. Hire well. Make sure it's somebody that deserves to be your boss, who will lead you well, who will guide you well, who will develop your talents and cultivate you and kick your butt when you're not performing. And if the person who you've hired to be your boss now isn't performing, fire them as your boss and go hire one that can do it. But it is your career. It is your life. It is your profession. It is at some point you chose the field you're in for some reason, and you loved it. I've actually talked to folks who worked in slaughterhouses before, and for them it's about feeding the world, and they help. Now in the places where it's done corruptly and it's not to standards and regulations that I have heard the horror stories, and so that's a different issue when there's severe cruelty involved in the work of trying to feed people. It's a different issue, and you shouldn't stay in an environment like that. And I get when you hear yourself saying, but I have to because, and it's a financial obligation, it's a family obligation, it's whatever. really, really kick the tires on that assumption, because the more you imprison yourself to that assumption, the more you'll not test it and just assume there's no other option. Then you become bitter and angry. Now you're drinking after work or doing all kinds of other turning to other unhealthy choices to numb your soul. That's a really slippery slope. So the first thing is to do is get clear and define or redefine who you really want to be in the world, and how would you know you were doing it, and how far from that have you departed. And then start using that as screening criteria for an environment to work in that it won't ever be perfect, but comes much closer than the one you're in if the one you're in sucks.
Awesome. Well, you touched on a lot of great points there. One I really liked and had never considered the perspective switch of interviewing your boss. And I think that there's so much to learn in this world that if you, and I don't know if I heard this from a guest or just thought about it, probably it was a guest, but taking, when you're moving up the ladder or you're out in the world and you have a job, get a good job that you're going to learn a set of skills. And so if you're in an organization that's going to cultivate your training, your growth, your expertise, and your knowledge, that's going to give you a lot of power and knowledge moving forward. Is a really practical thing to do. And I also like what you said about, do the research, take the time. You don't have to jump out in 3 weeks. Just, that something isn't right, do that internal check, and then start making practical steps in a different direction that is more aligned with who you are once you've kind of reset that internal compass to where you'd like to go. So really great practical advice. I know we're getting a little bit pressed on time, so I'm going to throw a little bit your way and you can touch on what you wish. But in your company, you talk about leadership, organization, and strategy. So I'm wondering if you want to maybe share a little bit about some principles. And this kind of goes into the second question of, what if you're going into an organization or you're talking to a young entrepreneur or a person who's going in business, what are the most important keys or values or principles to help them give them the best chance at success?
So I'll sort of do a recap of what I said before on those principles: strategy, organization, and leadership. And in the startup world, they separate those things as three different things. And as companies mature, they get even blurrier. Your organization, the way you configure your work, is nothing more than an embodiment of your strategy. If this is who you say you are, then build a machine to be that. Leadership is the act of coalescing all that so it works, right? As an entrepreneur, you have to, if you're so busy working in your organization, but you're not making any time to work on your organization, then you're failing it. You have to extract yourself enough to make sure that who you say you are and how you've configured the work match. And so often as you grow, you get to more of the mid-cap world where you've scaled to, pick it, 30 million, 50 million, 80 million, $100 million. But the problem is you grew, but you didn't scale. So you're the classic $80 million company trapped in the body of a $20 million organization. And you're like the teenage boy in his dad's suit, or the little girl in her mom's gown, right? You haven't grown into yourself yet. But then the problem is you're so busy keeping the wheels on the bus, you can hear them grinding, you can hear the seams ripping, but you won't stop and fix it. And so wherever you're at in your maturation, when you recognize something is off, something is not working, let the early signs of pain, customers defecting, employees leaving, margins eroding, don't just convince yourself it's all going to work itself out, or it's a season, or this is to be expected, this happens. Don't, if you're rationalizing some performance shortfall or some misstep or some confusing moment, stop. You ignore the stomach ache, you ignore the being doubled over, you ignore the fact that you couldn't breathe, and now you hear the word stage 4, right? You have the information. Our bodies give us feedback. Our organizations are like bodies. They send you signals when they need help. And leaders are very predisposed to ignore them and dismiss them until, you come to a crippling halt. Don't wait. Listen to the signals of pain. Same is true with your own career. If you're stopping at the bar on the way home, if you're making unhealthy choices and compromising relationships, if you're lying, if you find yourself, in front of a room of people, embellishing yourself, embellishing your contribution, denying a mistake, making commitments you can't keep, ask yourself, why am I lying? There's some need you're meeting. You're not, I mean, unless you're a sociopath, you get drugs for that. But if you're not a sociopath, then ask yourself, why did I just lie? There was some need I was trying to meet, some unmet need of purpose, legitimacy, validation, inclusion that I was trying to meet. Why did you think telling that lie would meet it? Because you know what happened? You convinced the people. You may have convinced people of something that's not true. Now you have to keep up that lie. So the hit of dopamine you may have gotten to feel good in that moment of gotten a reaction you know you didn't deserve, now only makes you feel shameful. And the imposter you felt you were, you don't have to become in order to keep up that illusion. Stop the cycle, and extract yourself. If the environment is if you're feeling the only way to get what your needs met is to be untruthful, then and you're justified. Well, if they can, I can, or I deserve, and they're not telling me, or well, they're doing it, so I have to. If you're hearing yourself trying to convince yourself that your lying is justified, that's your body saying, and your spirit saying, uh-oh. Don't wait till you hear the words, whether it's emotional, spiritual, perfect career, or literally physical, stage 4. Don't wait to that. But all those early things that you're doing or saying, those are all indicators to you that, gosh, I gotta call time out here.
Awesome, man. Well, I think that everything that you shared today is 100% applicable to whether you're in a big business or even a small family, just the honesty study and what that means and how you can cultivate that in a small business, in a household, in a big organization, and just really practical, grounded stuff. I know you got to get going. So where can people find more about you? If they want to dive a little bit deeper, you can look your name. There's a couple TED Talks that you've done. You've written 8 books. You can check those out. Some of them are on leadership and different things. But is there anything that you wish that I had asked or you want to share with the listeners before we go?
Yeah. So come to visit us at our website, Navalent, Navalent.com. We've got lots of great resources there. We've got some fun, really wonderful videos and some white papers and we have a great blog, and we have a quarterly magazine we publish on all kinds of stuff about this. It's a free subscription. And if you want to learn more about change, if you have personal change to create or change in your team, we have a free ebook on leading transformation. So if you got change ahead of you, come to navalent.com/transformation. You can download that free ebook. It's our playbook on how we go into organizations and create change.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much.
Twitter at Ron Carucci, and also on LinkedIn. So stay in touch.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you coming on, and what a really important, body of work and study, because I think that entrepreneurship and taking an idea that you are passionate about, making it successful, making an impact in your community, and potentially the world if it keeps going out there, like adding value. You spoke on that a few times, so just adding value in your corporation, adding value in your community. If you're in a business, you need to add value somewhere. And so if we can come from those elements and be honest with ourselves and in our organization, we can make a pretty positive impact. It starts with you and your family, then it leaks out to your community and then the world. And there's simple principles. And I've seen chaotic organizations, and I would think that there's probably more chaotic organizations than there are not. So I appreciate your work and the simple congruence and what you're doing. So thanks a lot for coming on the show.
Hey, Matt, it's been great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, guys, for watching. See you in the next one. Peace.